Thanks, Angus. Let me share my screen with you guys. Hopefully everyone should be able to see that clearly. So as Angus mentioned, my name is Adrian Fleming, formerly the founder and CEO of Acuvio, a sustainability and ESG reporting software solution we founded back in 2009 when nobody really knew what sustainability and ESG was. People often thought we were mad when we said we were building a system to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions. But thankfully, things have changed over the last 10 or 12 years, and we're very pleased to be part of the Diligent ecosystem now. One thing before we start today, I suppose I've tried to make today very practical and very helpful for people at various levels of their journey within ESG. So hopefully, even if you're setting out and you're just trying to figure out what's going on with ESG, what is it? What's it about? Hopefully you should find some useful information there. But equally, if you're sort of middle of the road along your journey and you're looking to get a head start for further or even at a mature level, you should have some pointers. So I'm hopefully going to make this very practical. So a good point earlier on was, I suppose, that there's a lot of acronyms today, so please forgive me if I rattle through them and I'll do my best to pause at the acronyms and explain them. Of course, GRC is governance, risk and compliance. Diligent is probably best known in Ireland in particular for its boards software. So many of the company boards around the country are using this boards software to collate everything. So Diligent has a great track record and a great pedigree there. And that's what made the acquisition of Acuvio so sensible, I suppose, because we're both selling into the same groups, into the C-suite. So, today I'm just going to cover, the what and the why, the drivers, so you can understand the underlying rationale for doing it in the first place. I think everyone wants to see the trends. Everyone wants to get a head start on that. And, being an international organization, we get to see a lot of those trends and how they're progressing. I'm going to focus a little bit then on the opportunity for Irish companies based on what I see internationally as well, and how we can maybe get an edge, and some practical tips and tricks in that regard, and some solutions that are out there and to bear in mind. So the what and the why. So ESG, lots of people would define it as many different things. Here's a traditional definition of ESG, but if I was to sum it up in one word, ESG is about integrity. And integrity in how you run your business. And often people would define integrity as doing the right thing even when nobody is looking. So if you can bear that in mind when you're talking about non-financial reporting, that often helps to square it away in terms of what you should report, what you shouldn't report, and how you should report it. So what is ESG? So environmental, social governance. So back to basics. So in terms of the E, you've got everything from climate change, biodiversity, and so on. Perhaps the most time-consuming part of that for people is the greenhouse gas emissions reporting, because of the nuances of all of the emissions factors and all of that good stuff. And that's what Acuvio became famous for in our small little office in Limerick, internationally. So that is an area that I'm happy to take any detailed questions on, but of course we'll keep it high level for today. Under the social side of things, this has very much grown following the UNPRI kind of commitments in 2015, 2016. And we've seen a lot of this social metrics and indeed the governance metrics have been driven by the investment community, namely institutional investors demanding more insight and more metrics and numbers on these kind of items. So, I think everyone is familiar with, the equal opportunities. So gender balance at various levels of our organization, gender pay gap, they're very topical at the moment in Europe. In various different parts of the world, then, you've got other focuses such as human rights, child labor, customer products responsibility, and the list is endless. For anybody who wants to have a look at the list, there is the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and it has an extensive list of all of the metrics that you can and should report, and depending upon your capabilities. Under governance, I think the one that's probably not listed here is anti-bribery and corruption. It's probably the one that comes up most often, but that falls under business ethics and compliance, of course, board independence, executive compensation, and shareholder democracy, as well as many other factors. All of these combined are what we deem, insights into a company's performance
I think Adrian has just frozen there. We might give a minute there for him to come back on. We'll just give it a minute there to see, can he get his connection back. I think you're back, Adrian.
I think so too. Zoom decided that I was no longer worthy of its presence, so it decided to boot me out. I'm back, I think. Hopefully you can see my screen again.
Can you put technology in one of those lists there as well, Adrian, please?
Should do. So non-financial reporting in a business context. So, where did this come from? Effectively putting performance alongside financial metrics, and the importance of having these accurate and correct has been emphasized over the past number of years, in terms of if your non-financial metrics are questionable or not based on reputable standards and protocols, then equally that undermines your financial metrics. So having that level of accuracy is increasingly important. Strong indicators of management capability and adaptability. This is something that people are often surprised about. So, institutional investors like BlackRock and Vanguard and these guys, they're not shy in telling organizations that, when they see a company and they're assessing it and they see that it's either not disclosing anything in the ESG space or it is doing so poorly, that reflects poorly on the management and the management's ability to cater for rapid change, and to adapt to a changing business landscape. So it's more of an insight, not so much about, what are they doing in the environmental area or social governance, but more so, well, are they even recognizing this, or are they burying their heads in the sand? So it's an interesting one in its own right. ESG metrics and performance is also a very strong indicator of company resilience to change. So, historically and anecdotally, we have seen in the UK in particular, organizations that were doing voluntary ESG reporting, and specifically around carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. They adapted quicker and far more profitably to the newly introduced legislation. It was basic and simple for them to adopt, whereas other organizations really struggled to get their house in order to report their greenhouse gas emissions and other ESG metrics when the legislation hit. Some companies, it can take them 2 to 3 years at best to get the systems in place, to get their data in place, and to get their people in place in order to comply with some of these legislationary items. So it's quite a relief to many investors when they see that they're already doing it. So if there is a future legislative requirement that needs them to have that kind of level of granular data, they have it, or at least they're materially halfway there. And of course, it's a good risk indicator, and that goes without saying. I mean, obviously, you've got an insight into the current risks and of course the future risks. Flipping it onto the positive side, and I'm always a carrot on stick kind of guy. A lot of people focus on ESG as a stick. I would actually look at it in the reverse. I would see ESG as probably the greatest, business opportunity that has existed in a long time, probably since the start of kind of the technology boom, I guess. And there's a lot of untapped brand value out there, and companies that have, gone after that have done very well already. And there's untapped opportunity by setting themselves apart as a differentiator, but also looking at products that have a better ESG credentials and untapped competitive advantage, which goes without saying as well. So, I prefer to look at it in those terms. What and why I mentioned this earlier on, ESG equals integrity. In the past, often it was viewed as a box ticking exercise. Now it's much more than that. So bear that in mind when you're considering what you do report and how to report it. So what's driving all of this? Why are we even talking about this? And why has it become such an issue over the past 2 to 3 years in particular? The key thing is the investment community. The investor community, I suppose, have signed up to the UNPRI, or just the PRI, as it's known now, the Principles for Responsible Investment, whereby they have made significant commitments to ensure that their investees are actually reporting and tracking non-financial reporting metrics or non-financial metrics to give them insights into those environmental social governance items that we discussed earlier. And that's perhaps the biggest driver. Second to that would be legislation. And people often, particularly in the United States, I see people are kind of, a little bit more saying, oh, well, we'll wait for the legislation to hit. And, investors are taking a dim view of that because obviously it's a little bit too late. They don't realize that it can take 2 to 3 years for them to get their data and people in place in order for that to happen. And that's even more acute at the moment with the severe shortage of ESG staff in the marketplace. So it's taking quite a long time. There's a lot of competition for good people in that area. The third driver is the opportunity and international competitiveness. And this is an area that I want to focus on today because, I'm based in County Clare, born and raised in County Clare, very much an Irishman, even though I've spent a lot of time internationally, talking about sustainability and working in sustainability, and I want to do what I can for for companies in Ireland. And I see that unfortunately, many Irish companies are at a disadvantage in an international competitive standpoint. And, we already internationally have a fantastic green reputation. It's just now we're being asked to back it up. So with a little effort, we can actually back it up quite easily and compete internationally. Even if we have a good bit to go to catch up to some of our competitors, even just by starting the journey, we can create a disruptive environment. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later with some tips and tricks. Public sentiment and brand equity is an increasing area as well, particularly with the younger generation. Any of you who would be familiar with terms like fast fashion, where a lot of people, love to go to Pennies and pick up loads of cheap items and are kind of proud that they've only paid €2 for this T-shirt or whatever it is. And there's an increasing push towards, buying better quality stuff that lasts longer rather than throwaway fashion items. And Pennies in particular have done great work in terms of incorporating recycled materials into their products, and have done an awful lot of work in terms of cleaning up their ESG performance as well over the last number of years, and that should be acknowledged. And public sentiment and brand equity, I think that's a good example. Nike as well as another example. They had a very poor record going back 10, 12 years ago around modern day slavery in the Western world, but child labor in the developing world. And they've done exceptional work in terms of cleaning that up as well. So, and they are recognized, as a leader in that area. And that's why they're doing so well in these points. And employees are now demanding that. We see a lot of people, when we were part of IQVIO, we had people jumping over, every sort of an obstacle to work for IQVIO because they knew that, particularly the younger generation, because they knew that we were part of the solution. And they wanted to be part of that. And, that made us very competitive in the hiring areas, so we were actively competing with the big multinationals for key people, and we were able to do that at a lower cost base. And, people are demanding that. Increasingly, people are putting, working for a company of integrity above, financial gain. And that's an important element to remember when you're thinking of ESG. Just to touch upon each of these points in a bit more detail, and these slides will be shared later as well. So, feel free to wait on those. I'm not going to go into each in detail, but investment, obviously it highlights risk and it highlights opportunity and adaptability. I think I've touched on that already, but it gives future insights and it gives indicators for investors to hang on in terms of, how is this company doing in the future? Now, sometimes organizations will say, you know what, we've done an assessment internally, we're not telling anybody because it's really poor by comparison to our competitors. And I have encountered that quite a bit, and it's an understandable reaction, but the investor view of that is that there's absolutely nothing going on. Whereas they would be better off saying, coming out and publicly saying, okay, we've started the journey. We recognize, that we have to do this. This is our current state, and this is where we want to get to, and these are our goals. This is how we're going to get there. Now, in that kind of a statement, they haven't really done anything. They've just set out a 3, 5, 10-year target, but it addresses many of the concerns of an investor. And actually, an investor would look at that as an opportunity, because right now the stock would be somewhat stifled by the lack of ESG metrics, but the potential is there to grow in a period of time in the future. And that for them is a growth opportunity and a better return on their investment. So think of it that way. That's certainly the way they're thinking about it. Again, here's some examples of these risks. Sometimes people say to me, well, what are they really worried about? I mean, how can a financial services company based in Dublin really be, at risk in an ESG area? Well, here are some of the examples that often people are concerned about: bribery, corruption, modern day slavery. Particularly when they're outsourcing work to third parties to do maybe data entry, that kind of thing. Looking at, how they interact with more junior members of staff, these kind of things. Diversity and gender balance are obviously two key areas as well that they would see as risk areas that they want to see managed. And environmental incidents, they also want to see that, they're engaging with the community. They're working on their brand. They want to make sure the brand isn't viewed as a dirty thing. It's actually it's looked upon as a very positive brand that stands for, integrity and ethics and so on. So legislation, when we're talking about Ireland, we haven't got direct carbon legislation as they would have in the UK and other areas. There is, of course, some legislation which impacts listed companies. We've got a sample of them here, the EU taxonomy regulation, SFDR, Sustainability Financial Disclosure Regulation, TCFDs in the UK, and ESG measures. There are some areas in there that we need to be aware of. Obviously, then there are some energy metrics that impact us, but not to the same degree as some of the reporting legislation in the UK and further across Europe. We're also seeing that a lot of the legislation is coming down the tracks in the United States, and that's probably going to have a trickle-down effect. But when we're talking about trickle-down effects, what we are actually seeing in the marketplace is that organizations that are being impacted by legislation in one geography are taking a more holistic view. Then rather than just dealing with the legislation, they're putting in an overall sustainability or ESG program. And as part of that, there is a supply chain element. And it's that supply chain element that's impacting us in Ireland quite a lot, because we supply a lot of our goods and services into these organizations. And as we supply them, we're being asked as part of RFP processes for key metrics around our ESG performance, including greenhouse gas emissions, among many other items. And we're not performing as well as our competitors. Now, in the last few years, that was okay. It wasn't okay, but it wasn't damaging us too badly. But now these organizations, I'll take Tesco as an example, are now ratcheting up the points that are available for ESG disclosures in those RFP responses. So much so now that it is actually hurting us. It is damaging us significantly. And that's something that will only increase. And they, as well as many other organizations, have set that out, that they're going to continue to increase the points available for ESG disclosures. So in terms of trends and being aware of what's coming, keep an eye on that. I'm just going to keep track of time here myself. The opportunity, international competitiveness, I think I've touched on these already. I'm trying to tie them together so you can see how legislation impacts one, impacts the other. So even though there may not be legislation in Ireland, I would suggest that you keep an eye on legislation in the countries that you sell into, because that will have a trickle-down effect, probably quicker than legislation will arrive in Ireland, in my personal opinion. Or at least significant legislation. There is, of course, already legislation. I'm talking about significant, that would be more broader. In terms of a B2B context, customer RFPs, I've mentioned competitive disclosures, competitive differentiator, and a higher price point. There's a fantastic video out there that Bill Gates has authored around what he calls the green premium. This is where it's an increasing trend across the world, where members of the public are willing to spend anything up to 25% more on a product that has green credentials, that stands for something, versus a similar or superior product at a cheaper price. So that's an interesting one. And obviously being on a green island and having that reputation already, ever before the ESG phrase came out, we are already viewed that way. We're just now being asked to prove it and to substantiate our claims. In a B2B context, that's even stronger. the brand value and equity, like the Nike example I gave earlier on, positive consumer sentiment, competitive differentiator. All of these exceptionally valid, in particular in the international context. This is also where there's a lot of opportunity. So looking for a differentiator or looking for something different, focusing on a green branding without going into greenwashing is probably the area that we haven't tapped most, in my opinion. Drivers of ESG reporting, brand equity. I've touched on this a few times already, but I think more and more consumers are expecting businesses to invest in sustainability, the environment, and society. And the point I would make here is that this is not just for large organizations, right? I'll take, for example, Acuvio, a small company, less than 50 people, based in Limerick, but we had an ESG program. Our ESG program was to get involved in Coder Dojo, where our software developers were actually allowed to go out on company time and take part in these Coder Dojo programs, whereby we were teaching kids how to write software development on the weekends and during the weeks at schools and various places. And the kids were being given a safe environment to be geeky, like me and my co-founder wanted when we were younger. We were definitely into computers, into software. We didn't really have a safe environment to do so, where there was a kind of an ecosystem of people to help us and so on. So we've provided that with Coder Dojo, and I'm proud to say that when we started off with Coder Dojo, there was a Coder Dojo once every Saturday in Cork, and then we started Limerick, then we started Ennis, we started Shannon, and now I think there's over 3,000 Coder Dojos worldwide. Assisting up to 15,000 kids every week in terms of exploring this area. So that's an area where we got involved in ESG, something that was aligned to our personal or to our business goals, software, but equally has a positive influence on the environment, or on the environment, but also the people around us. So look at your business. Look at what positive elements you could do, not just in relation to the environment, but society and environment in general. What can you give back? And that effectively is a good ESG program as well. Drivers, employees. So we're seeing this a lot, even ourselves these days. Obviously with Diligent, we're hiring aggressively, and we're seeing people who are choosing Diligent over other companies, simply because ESG is core to the strategy going forward, and there's a lot of activity in that area. There's an opportunity there for every organization to differentiate themselves, but also to retain staff, and to market their company in the kind of in the recruitment war, as somebody called it recently, that's ongoing at the moment. So bear that in mind as another driver. We're seeing that as a particular driver in the technology space. So the likes of Google, Facebook, these guys, they're all competing against each other, and it's these non-tangible areas that are helping them to differentiate between one another. Here's a question that some people, say to, or here's something that, some people in Ireland say to me quite a bit is, I'll keep an eye on it, but it's not really impacting me right now. And in some instances, they're correct. Aside from the fact that for some organizations, it can take, 2 to 3 years to get up and running before you can comply with legislation, for example. But the question I would say is, are your customers, particularly in a B2B context, asking for this information? If so, for how long have they been asking that information? You would be surprised how many organizations come to us and they say, hey, one of our biggest customers, let's say the NHS, has been looking for this information for the last 6 years. The C-suite weren't aware of it for some reason. And now it's our hair is on fire. We have to get this sorted. And they come to us and they're saying, hey, we need the system in place like yesterday. And you'd be very surprised at how that happens. So what I would often recommend is individuals in a senior leadership position within organizations, ask the question of the folks who are dealing with clients on a day-to-day basis. Ask them, are our biggest customers looking for this information? And you might be surprised by the answer. And that will help you to get ahead. Why are they not flagging it regularly? Typically, the answer is that they flagged it back in 2015, 2016, and they were ignored. And so they just haven't bothered to flag it again. So it's no harm to, now that it's a more, important element than ever, it's no harm to ask the question. And are your competitors reporting or disclosing this information as well, as another question? And if they're not, there's an opportunity to take a differentiating and leading position. So trends. As I said, before I go any further, I suppose, look, there's a lot of material in here, and I'm doing my best not to use too many acronyms. And if I have, somebody please shoot me. I'll do my best in the Q&A to explain them. In terms of trends, it's important to see how things are progressing over time. There are different trends in Europe, UK, Ireland, than there is in the US or in Middle East and Asia. There are different trends around the world. Each is at a different maturity stage. And it's interesting for us. We've seen things happen in the UK when they were starting off in kind of 2009, 2010, 2011 that are repeating themselves in other jurisdictions. And we've helped companies to kind of leapfrog some of those issues, some of those challenges, by just kind of saying, look, this is what happened in the UK. This is what they did back then, but it took them 5 years to get there. If you do that in year one, then you'll probably get to the same position, but 4 years quicker. So there's some advantages in being a laggard in the ESG journey to some extent. So in terms of trends, we would break this down into early, mid, and mature stage. In the early stage, there's some areas here. So price no longer always trumps ESG is often a surprising one. Requirement of verification of green credentials. So, in the past, something I spotted in numerous events was people would have the FSC logo, which is for sustainable forestry. And that logo would be printed on the back of brochures at a sustainability event. But you knew by the feel of the card that it couldn't possibly be from a recycled paper or whatever it might be. So I think people are being a little bit more skeptical, and they're looking to verify everything. And as organizations that are in the space, we have to be guarded as well, that we check our supply chain, and that if a supplier is telling us that they're providing a certain product or good that comes from a good background, we need to verify that. We need to double check it. In that particular example around the brochures, it's often the design company adds in that logo, and they don't really think too much about it. So it's more about just double checking. Ask the designer. Okay, there's an FSC logo in there, or there's a recycled paper logo in there, and are you sure that the paper this is being printed on is actually coming from recycled sources, or is it recyclable? The other one that we see quite a lot of as well is compostable. The compostable label is put on an inordinate amount of products, and particularly in the United States, but it's actually not at all compostable. So we just need to challenge this and keep an eye on that. We talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Reporting to voluntary initiatives is almost like a prerequisite to legislation compliance as well. So for early stage organizations, we would always encourage them to look at voluntary initiatives such as the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. Look at that. That's a good starting point. Look at the GRI for a broader ESG guidance. If you're looking to do the minimal, SASB, which is predominantly a US focused standard, but SASB gives you a very specific set of metrics that per sector you should be reporting on it at a minimum. So that's another way to look at it. Mid-stage is usually where organizations are looking to expand their reporting. So they've maybe started off with, just their scope 1 and scope 2 in terms of, scope 1 and scope 2 are greenhouse gas emissions reporting categories. So scope 1 is any emissions that you are directly responsible for. So for example, if you have a fleet of trucks, you're responsible for the emissions coming out of them. That's a scope 1. Any, if you're burning natural gas or kerosene or home heating oil or something like that in any of your buildings, then that's also a scope 1 emission. Equally, refrigerants in chillers and refrigeration units, air conditioning units, they're all scope 1 emissions that you should be taking responsibility for. And scope 2 is any purchased heat, steam, cooling, or electricity. Now, increasingly, when you get to the mid-stage, organizations are expanding it to scope 3, which is things like business travel, employee commuting, waste, water, and they're also expanding it out to their broader ESG metrics. They may just have started out in ESG doing gender balance, but now they're looking at ethnic diversity, anti-bribery, anti-bribery and corruption, modern day slavery. They're looking into their supply chain. So that's kind of something at a mid-stage. And the mature stage, the trends there seems to be more frequent materiality assessments. And I'll cover materiality assessments in a few minutes. and reconfirming their operational and organizational boundaries and looking further into their supply chain. The opportunity for Irish companies, I would highlight this again, looking at the various geographies. If you're selling into the UK and the EU, there's a more mature market there. RFPs have had low weighting in the past, but now they are increasing the amount of weighting that they're allocating to the ESG scoring for their suppliers. Be aware of that. Get ahead of that if you can. Where it's below par, set the scene as that you're at the early stage of your journey. So I mentioned this before, that rather than just ignoring that section, state clearly that you're acknowledging that this is something that you need to do. You're starting out on your journey. What are you doing to tackle it? And how are you tackling it? What are your 1, 3, 5, 10-year targets? It's much better than saying that you're not doing anything or just ignoring that question. You're just leaving the reader to assume the worst. And you know what? For a lot of companies, and one in particular I had a discussion with, and I asked them, okay, they're a US kind of large kind of technology retailer. And I just kind of said, look, if somebody doesn't respond or responds that they're starting out in the journey, their answer was, well, we're looking for risk here. We don't want to find out that one of our suppliers is totally operating with no controls whatsoever on these ESG risks. If they at least acknowledge that they should have been reporting and tracking these, and now they're starting to, that's a hell of a lot better than saying that they haven't been doing anything and they have no intention of doing anything. So that's the mindset. That's what you should be aware of. In the USA and Canada, it's a less mature market than the UK and the EU. Ireland is somewhere in the middle. We're somewhere in the middle between the UK and the EU and the USA and Canada in terms of our own domestic maturity. It varies. We have some of our leading companies who are doing exceptionally well. AIB are doing exceptionally well. Kingspan, DCC Group PLC as well, another organization doing really well. These companies are active in this area. They're acknowledging the challenges. They're working hard on it. But then there's a lot of companies then that aren't doing a huge amount. So there is an opportunity to set a leadership position in the US in particular. Even modest ESG achievements here in Ireland will actually be superior to most of your US competition. So bear that in mind. So no matter how small the achievement is, leverage that. Internally, position the Irish site. So if you're in a multinational and you're representing the Irish organization, position the Irish site as a leader, because we have a more mature EMEA ESG talent pool, and also, it's a little easier for us to kind of set that forward. There's a little bit we're more receptive culturally to some of the change than some areas in the US. Just to bear that in mind. So practical tips and tricks. This is the part a lot of people just wait for, and this is probably the bit that loads of people will just watch the recording on. Tips and tricks. The biggest problem really is people get overwhelmed, okay? And there are so many, they will, sometimes after a talk like today, they would go home and they would get up from their working from home desk and go to the kitchen, and then they would come back later and they might read a passage from the GRI Bible, so to speak. The GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative, where it lists out an exhaustive list of all of the things that you can report, and immediately they put it to one side and they say, there's just too much there, I can't do all of it. So they get frightened off from the very beginning. They say it's too much, we need more people, we need more resources, we need more staff, and nothing happens. That's often called ESG paralysis. So what we would recommend is, to get started, you do what's called a materiality assessment. Now, traditionally, a materiality assessment is done by a consultancy firm, facilitating a walkthrough as to, what should you be reporting. It would involve surveying, discussions, various working sessions. During the pandemic, we've seen a shift in materiality assessments to being done almost desktop, an initial materiality assessment. Of course, the best way to do a materiality assessment is to be facilitated by a group of experts, no question. But in the absence of that, in the absence of resources to do this, and you just want to figure out where to get started, a materiality assessment can involve discussions with your employees, board, various members of management, your suppliers, your customers, and investors, shareholders. If you have a conversation with them and you just say, hey, we're looking at starting out on our ESG journey, what do you think the metrics that we should be reporting on are? Or what do you think are the key areas that we should be looking into are. And look at your competitors as well. What are they doing? Compare yourself against that. That should help you to narrow down a kind of a starting list, and just tackle that, prioritize that. From that, define a 1, 3, 5, and 10-year plan. Within that plan, define what metrics are you going to tackle in year 1? What are you going to tackle, in year 2, 3, 4, and so on. Get some help from other people in the organization by establishing what's often called a green team or a green committee. And sometimes, people might laugh at this, but if you go out to the broader organization, you say, hey, we're trying to establish a green committee. People will often say, oh, look, I've already got enough on my plate. I haven't got time for it. But what you'll find is that more junior people within the organization who are looking to, set themselves apart from the others and are ambitious in their career path, they will actually put their hands up and they will quite diligently get stuck into this material and take an interest in it. They'll be part of the solution, like I mentioned earlier on. So don't underestimate people's enthusiasm to get involved in a committee like that to help out. If you're starting late and maybe your competitors are already way ahead, sometimes people's response to that is to just stay in the current position. In that scenario, it's about communication. It's about communicating that you acknowledge that this is there. We've had challenges in the past, or maybe you just haven't done anything, and now we're setting out, but this is our target. We're going to be, at a certain level within a certain period of time. And for some companies, by the way, people talk about CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. That scores your results, and you can get an A, B, C, just like being back in school. But for some organizations, the right score to be at on a constant basis is B or C. It really depends on the organization. You have to balance the organizational needs with ambitions and their overall impact. So don't think that it's all about getting to an A. In some instances, it is. In others, a C is more than effective. And if you're overwhelmed, go back to the materiality assessment. Often what happens in organizations is they go to a senior member of management and they say, we need to be doing all of these items. And the investors say, you need to be reporting to all of these frameworks. Go back and challenge them. Why? Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to do that? Why do we need to do the other one? And what you'll find is you'll be able to narrow it down to a core set of reporting frameworks, a core set of metrics to start with. Ask them to prioritize, ask them to give you their top 3 wishes. And then that will help you to hone in on it. And the 5th one here is, there are too many choices between the frameworks. Again, engage with the various stakeholders through that materiality assessment. Try and figure out, what's most material and focus on these first. When you're looking at topics as well, in the broader ESG, outside of the greenhouse gas emission stuff, when you're looking at broader ESG, it's often useful to get the creative juices flowing by having a look at the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And these are a set of categories of metrics and activities whereby you can consider, and maybe you're not expected to do all of these. That's the thing that often people get confused about. You're not expected to do all of these. You're expected to pick the ones that are most aligned to your business, and to focus in on those and to see what you can do about it. So pick one of these and work with it. And if you're in an area that doesn't relate to any of these, or maybe it's the common one I come across is, hey, we're in financial services, we're an insurance firm, or we're a bank. Which of these, would be best for us? Any of them. It's really just, pick one. Poverty, zero hunger, pick one and focus in on it. Pick 3, pick 5, pick 8. Pick 2 year 1 and pick another 2 in year 2. It's really up to yourself. But each of these, if you go onto the Sustainable Development Goals website, there's an extensive detail about subcategories, and you'll get some great ideas in there about where to start in terms of the broader ESG, in terms of engaging with various community groups and the public. So I think, in terms of today, in terms of giving you an overall start, I hope that, from what I've gone through there, I've given you kind of a good idea in terms of what to do if you're starting out, if you're middle of the road, what to do there. And if you're mature, one of the trends that I mentioned earlier on that we're seeing, and I had another couple of calls yesterday on it, is, there's an increasing demand and trend within mature organizations that have been reporting for about 10 years or more, that they're now starting to realize that their assessments, or sorry, that their assumptions from 10 years ago are now out of date. So what they're actually looking at doing is, they're redoing their materiality assessments, and they're setting themselves up to do the materiality assessments every 2 years. They're reestablishing their operational and organizational boundaries by reassessing at a site level, what has been done in terms of modernizing their buildings and their fleet, and reassessing that. And they're also challenging their data sources. So they're looking at, if we've been taking data from a particular system for that particular reporting, is there a better way of doing that? Can we automate it? Can we look at ways of doing this more efficiently? And in terms of solutions, so the materiality assessment I've mentioned earlier on, the materiality assessment, again, the professional service providers out there, one of the things that I've been quite enthusiastic about here at Diligent is there's a super tool here under the governance, risk and compliance called HighBond that they acquired last year. And when I saw it, having been in the ESG space and knowing that there's such an opportunity out there for a more regularized, more digitized materiality assessment, I immediately recognized that this tool could be used quite easily for it. So we have already a prototype and a number of companies using a materiality assessment tool. Now it can be used as an assistant to a facilitator. So we're working with some of the consultancy firms to work alongside it, but equally some companies are actually choosing to use it themselves. So it's an interesting solution out there. And that's just looking at some innovation in the area. Obviously, Diligent are a software company. IQVIO is part of that. We have solutions there that can cater for any business at any size, everything from small companies to very large enterprise businesses, to put a financial grade control across all of the ESG metrics, establishing baselines, and recording and reporting metrics. One of the things as well that I really liked about Diligent is that one of the big challenges in ESG is data. And, we encountered it with IQVIO. We made several tools to automate data and capture them from various sources. And over the past 10 or 12 years, we recognized that ESG data has all of these quirks and nuances that doesn't exist within a traditional ERP or EHS scenario. And it has these really weird quirks that just, have caused me to go, somewhat gray, not exactly just yet, but nearly there. And maybe the video is hiding some of it. They're really frustrating. But Diligent has this robotics automation tool that actually can go gather data and then can transform it based on a series of rules and then insert it into a system like IQVIO. So we're working with them on adapting this to make the entire thing automated as well. So it's a really exciting area. It's really interesting, and I'm finding it fascinating. That will give us even more up-to-date data-driven decision capability as well. So the future is quite exciting in that area, and we're continuing to innovate. How do we solve these challenges? Flexible and efficient ESG data collection is the key thing. Certified climate and carbon measurement is another. Third-party ESG risk monitoring, as I mentioned before, and the IQVIO solution, if any of you haven't heard of IQVIO beforehand, was one of the first companies in the world to be accredited by the CDP, the GRI, SASB, and DJSI, and also we were the first company in the world to establish a partnership with the International Energy Agency. Granted, it was probably assisted by some Irish guys being on the board there, but it was a novel idea at the time that when the IEA did a set of emissions factors, that we would incorporate those into the IQVIO system as standard. It was breaking new ground back in 2014, 2015, and it still remains a differentiator in the marketplace today. So we are solving all of these issues with innovative solutions, and happy to help wherever we can. This is just a slide on Diligent. I'm admittedly still learning about Diligent. I only yesterday encountered another product within the Diligent ecosystem that actually could be very useful for supply chain ESG monitoring and scoring. It's just that the ecosystem within Diligent is so powerful, and there's a lot of systems in there. But here's a little bit about Diligent. I'm still learning myself. One of the things that I like about Diligent is very similar to IQVIO. We always put the customer first. So the client retention rates at IQVIO and Diligent are still, above 95%. Any of you who are not familiar with Diligent, within the boards sector. Already, a lot of the companies that I've spoken to in Ireland about Diligent are already aware of them in terms of the board software. The governance, risk, and compliance software solution as well is actually widely used, but perhaps it's headquartered in the United States, but the sites in Ireland are also using it. And so that's pretty much it for me. I think we should have about 10 minutes left for questions. Not doing too badly on time. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Well done, Adrian. That was really, really good. There are a couple of questions in the chat box.
I see them here.
But
okay.
I'm in control of the situation, so I get to ask my questions first, Adrian, if you don't mind.
I'll ask my questions first. I think that was a line from the Unbelievables, wasn't it?
There are the 70 plus people on this line, members of the chamber. Very few of them are in large organizations, and I'm guessing if they are in large organizations, somebody in head office is tasked with the headache of proving that the business is burnishing its ESG credentials, policies, website, notes to financial statements, actively doing stuff, and putting resources towards ESG. And look, absolutely get where this is going, for everybody. It's a wave of measurement, of data, of requirements, of everybody requiring this and making organizations attractive. But to our membership, who five-person companies, how is it relevant at this stage? Is it relevant for the organizations themselves to be burnishing their credentials, or is it from a supplier relationship into larger organizations that is maybe the immediate focus? But presuming that everybody wants to go on this journey, but maybe there's more immediate requirement. Where is that immediate requirement at the moment, Adrian, for smaller companies?
For smaller companies, I would say it's in differentiation, and just brand value. So if you take, for example, let's say if there's two coffee shops next to each other, and one of them is involved in a charitable event, and they have a poster at the front, or they have been active on Facebook or YouTube or TikTok or Snapchat or whatever it is about their active work in maybe PA to House, or they're doing some novel events around supplying coffee to the fire brigade at nighttime or something like that. You'll be more inclined, because of the brand value, you'd be more inclined to go in that door than the one next door, which isn't doing anything like that. There's brand value at the smallest level. There's also employee satisfaction, benefits of doing stuff like that. So the immediate, it's probably softer in terms of legislation and things like that. But there's another thing as well. Consumers are increasingly aware. If you go back to the coffee shop example, there's quite a lot of people would walk out of a coffee shop if they saw that the cups weren't recyclable or compostable. I've seen it, and that's an interesting take. I've also seen, fast food restaurants who are using, they went with the paper straws, which is admirable and brilliant. But then they dropped the paper cups and they went to plastic cups, which are even worse. Little things like that would actually, raise eyebrows, ask questions. And it's more about just giving people that kind of positive brand value when they use your product or service. You'll continue to use it. So, I think there's several little opportunities like that on a smaller scale. If we go kind of a little bit bigger than that, the same is true, just maybe in a different way. If there's an office of 10 or 15 people, perhaps the environmental impact isn't massive, as it was with Acuvio, in the earlier days. There was less than 10 of us there for a long time. I think there was 6 of us in the company when we started working on Coder Dojo. And so, that was positive. And, we got a lot of very positive feedback. And when we were talking to our customers, they were saying, what are you doing in ESG? And we were telling them about Coder Dojo, and they were looking up the Coder Dojo website and we were saying, this is amazing, crikey, let's get on. It was a talking point. It was a differentiator. So when we were in a competitive situation, sometimes people would bring us up and they would say, hey, look, we've decided to go with a QBO. And by the way, just to let you know, I've contacted a few of my colleagues and we're going to start a Coder Dojo here in London or Kent. And if you look at the map on coderdojo.com, you'll actually see a lot of UK locations. And I've been to most of those locations. So, there's a positive influence in being, having something to differentiate yourself from an ESG perspective as well. So there's no such thing as too small. It's just a matter of finding the right thing.
I do remember being dragged out to Coder Dojo in the Insight in Dangan at 10 o'clock on a Saturday mornings and not having a clue what was going on. But being a good dad, getting through it for a while. Come here, a couple of questions in the chat function. You've touched on a few, but specifically just to hone in on them. First one, and I'll put these two together. How should companies get started if they have not done anything yet, specifically startups, and at what point should they begin, assuming never too early? And then the second question is around comms. Some businesses are doing good things quietly, but they're not mapping it or doing comms around ESG. How best to share the good news? So
I'll tackle the second one first, around communications. Communication is absolutely paramount, and it's a thing we're really guilty of in Ireland. Is we don't promote ourselves. We're really, we're happy to go silently and do these great deeds, but we should be recognizing this, and we should be holding people up above ourselves. People who take the time to do these initiatives, particularly charity events, or taking an interest in doing a particular waste recycling program within an organization or whatever it might be. Communication is key. Getting it out to the masses. I mean, in a formal sense, communicating on your website is probably the best way to do it. Secondary to that, in my opinion, would be social media. Sometimes people are looking for those viral clips, but they don't always happen. So just getting it out on social media that you are doing something and what you're doing and how you're doing it doesn't have to be a big production. I've seen some very effective things recorded on, iPhones and put up on Facebook and on YouTube, and in TikTok is increasingly popular, Snapchat, Instagram, these kind of things. Just get the news out there any way you can, but the website to start. The other thing to remember is that there's a whole country of journalists out there who love to see anything to do with ESG. It's really easy to get ESG related articles published, really easy. So, if you're doing some good and you're doing a bit of an event, make it topical, make it interesting, write it up, send it to the journalist of choice or paper of choice, and you'd be surprised, what gets published. And if you write it in such a way that they don't have to go editing it, then it'll probably definitely get published. So there's lots of different ways there, but just don't be afraid to champion those people who are doing great work within an organization.
And the first question on when to begin, Adrian.
Yeah, there's no such time. There's no bad time to begin. Within a startup, having been there, it can be difficult. Obviously, because you're kind of under a lot of pressure with time and investors and so on and so forth. But start small. Find a little bit of time to do something, and it will take off from that. But in a startup, I would caution that you don't bite off more than you can chew. That would ultimately slow down the startup's position or start the startup's prospects. So pick something small. Maybe it's just giving some of your time to a local charity event or a charitable organization, or volunteering, or doing something novel like getting involved in a sleep out event or something like that. Something basic, simple, and easy. The other thing you can do, of course, is a lot of people are doing it in the UK, is offsetting their travel. So it's just I used to do it as well. When we would arrive into a meeting, I might have traveled transatlantic or something, and we would often offset the flight by buying offsets, or buying something towards trees that get planted to offset the emission from that. We did it a few times. Obviously the offsets is a bit controversial, but it's an area to look into.
Adrian, we're nearing the end, but there's just a question I think is really important to get in. Adrian, how important is the board of directors, I presume, in
Oh
your
God,
championing
this is a
ESG?
loaded question. I could
Are
go
you
on
seeing
for
it
another.
with a confidence? I suppose, look, one good thing is people have tuned into this, which is great. You know, there's a lot of guidance for directors out there. Like, it has to be the board. I mean, it's sorry. I mean,
Absolutely.
it has to be where it comes from. But, you know, CPD, like guidance, you know, certificates, diplomas, like surely this is where this is going for directors.
100%. 100%. I mean, look, if we were to tie this back into trends, the trend would be that, you know, any organization that was serious about sustainability, they needed a sustainability manager or a CSO, a chief sustainability officer. And, you know, you could tell if an organization was taking it seriously or not by who that person reported into. If they were reporting into marketing, then it was more greenwashing. If they were reporting into the board, then they were taking it seriously. Increasingly, in the more mature organizations, I'm seeing a new trend whereby organizations are actually assigning the CSO role to the CEO. And the CEO is supported by a couple of EAs who are sustainability experts. But the CEO is taking it upon him or herself to be the expert in sustainability and is taking a detailed interest in what they should be doing. Because to be fair, if ESG and sustainability is to be effective in an organization, it should be active in every level within the organization, ideally. And if that starts at the top, then it's a lot easier. So we're seeing that trend that the CSO role is being ditched in favor of the CEO taking that and just being supported by some internal resources and external resources as well.
Okay, listen, Adrian, there's some more questions there, but we've run out of time. So just to recap, that this session was recorded, so is available. We can send around. And look, all I can say at this stage is thanks very much for coming on. And this is certainly not the last we're going to hear of ESG. It's going to be big, big, big. So thanks again for your time, Adrian.
No problem.
And thank you everybody for dialing in today.
Thanks, everyone.